What happens to migrants or would-be asylum seekers at African borders when they no longer elicit the same humanitarian compassion or sympathy because the political community no longer views them as arising from political crisis or persecution? In the case of Zimbabwean migrants who are seeking asylum and livelihoods at the Zimbabwe-South Africa border, this paper argues that this temporality has translated into a protection regime that de facto excludes them, as their political categorization has gradually shifted from the remit of political persecution that is articulated in global protection regimes such as conventional refugee law. And with a reluctance to impress on the AU Refugee Convention, the paper suggests that this protection regime reveals how South Africa's protection mechanisms are not so much shaped or influenced by international law, regional or global protection norms alone, but by an interaction with expedient localized idioms, expressions, and interpretations of political crisis and their multiple overlapping temporalities. This interaction materializes into practices that shift the focus of key humanitarian actors in the migration world from offering protection to Zimbabwean migrants in ways that give a minimalist value and meaning to their lives. The paper goes on to conclude that this kind of migration governance and protection is best read as temporalized in the sense that it draws on expedient state positionings on crisis to determine vulnerability in ways that delegitimize any persecution that falls within the remit of novel protection issues not considered under serious harms, such as socioeconomic deprivation. My first exercise in this talk is to briefly draw the connections between the Zimbabwean crisis and the figure of the Zimbabwean economic migrant in South Africa. Under the leadership of Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe experienced the meltdown, which some of you may have heard of, which was characterized by an eroding value of salaries as a result mainly of hyperinflation, as well as the shortage of commodities that also resulted in long queues and a growing number of immigrants. Most Zimbabweans then left heading towards South Africa's vibrant economy. And this is the border that most of them migrated to, which is circled between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And in doing so, they sought refuge in the bushes and streets of the border town of Messina, located in this part of northern South Africa, which is about 15 kilometers from the border with Zimbabwe. This led to an influx of a number of humanitarian actors who came in to assist these immobile migrants, as the bureaucratic state lacked the capacity to do so. We know that a refugee reception office was opened in 2008 to process Zimbabwean migrant asylum applications. And then about a decade or so later, on the night of 15 December 2017, Zimbabwe witnessed the first change in leadership since independence of 1980, when Robert Mugabe left the position of Zimbabwe's president in 2017 by means of resignation. And some hoped that this would lead Zimbabwe to quickly recover from years of economic turmoil and authoritarian rule. But we know that since 2017, Zimbabwe has been led by Mugabe's former ally, who became an opponent, Emmerson Mnangagwa, after a contested coup. And Mnangagwa did a really great job at purveying an image of himself as an agent of change to root out corruption, election fraud, and transforming the economy. But many Zimbabweans have continued to come to South Africa for a number of reasons: political, humanitarian, and economic. And this attests to some of the images of congestion at the Zimbabwe-South Africa border that we saw in the festive season of 2020. South Africa's response to the coup as a state and also as the chair of the regional body of SADC gave legitimacy to this new dispensation. And the AU could also have taken punitive measures, but it chose not to. And yet we know that the only thing that really changed in Zimbabwe at this time was the person, and that is the figure of Mugabe, and not necessarily the ZANU-PF culture and administration. By legitimizing this so-called new dispensation, the South African government generated symbolic and internal boundaries of categorizing Zimbabweans as economic migrants who should not be protected since the country's governance crisis has been resolved, somewhat bringing an end to their vulnerability. And this legitimation has led to a presumption that all is well for Zimbabwean migrants in their home country, since the source of their problem is gone. However, we know for a fact that Zimbabwe's economy has been shrinking since 2008, as measured by the GDP in that country. This kind of context enables the South African society to also perceive representations of Zimbabwean migrants experiencing physical and sexual harm or death in some instances at that border as just mere instances of indigence that must be punished through a more robust criminalization or militarization of borders. And this has created a scenario where the refugee reception office as well at the border is open to Zimbabwean migrants on paper, but has developed its own de facto gatekeeping methods of barring Zimbabwean migrants, bringing clarity to the message that Zimbabwean migrants are not recognized as genuine asylum seekers, as was the case at one point. So there are all these bureaucratic barriers in place that would not apply to other groups. So for the sake of time, and also to open this up for discussion, I'm going to conclude by arguing that these developments are tied to how humanitarianism and humanitarian reasoning defines crisis, how it defines vulnerability, and how those definitions are shifting. So constituting humanitarian intervention as inherently a moving sovereignty that is more so by its categorical nature. And to use the words of one informant who was describing the UNHCR, they don't see the refugee anymore. South Africa, no, in the sub-Sahara, it's no longer their concern or priority. They're focusing on people who have got real problems. Yet, if Zimbabwean migrants are still fleeing politically induced economic crisis or survival migration, as other scholars have called it, I raise the question, should this not count as political persecution? And should this not be a basis for some kind of protection? Thank you.